Which of these stories will you be talking about tomorrow? Dogs, ponies, action. The Republican House is underway, repealing health care reform that it can never repeal. What kind of reform is it, boys?
Job destroying, job stifling.
You need to understand how insidious this bill is. This was written by smart people.
The Democrats poo-poo.
This isn't a serious legislative effort.
But this time the Dems have more than poo. They are prepared. The Health and Human Services report repealing health care reform would end insurance for those with pre-existing conditions, as many as 129 million Americans. Unlikely support. Ex-Senator Dr. Bill Frist says health care reform is here to stay, and it should be, quote, cuddled and, quote, snuggled. Ezra Klein on the health cuddling. Richard Wolff on the political snuggling. The Obama op-ed. Too many regulations put jobs at risk? Arianna Huffington, does that sound a little too, I don't know, Republican talking point-ish for you? Violent rhetoric and a possible next political shooting. New polling, a majority of Americans see cause and effect. So why are Mr. Secession, Mrs. Reload Don't Retreat, and Mr. Partially Topple the UN running? Wait, delusions of grandeur, anybody?
I think I could win the Republican nomination if I chose to run, because I do think I'm in the mainstream of the Republican Party.
As Gingrich warns Palin to slow down and think through what she's saying, she doesn't.
A group of people being falsely accused of having blood on their hands, that is what blood libel means.
No, too bad. Here's a toaster. Speaking of playing games, Facebook's plan to sell your private info and the revelation that those angry birds are pooping on your privacy. All the news and commentary now on Countdown. Good evening from New York. This is Tuesday, January 18th, 658 days until the 2012 presidential election. The Republican Don Quixotes planning to repeal health care reform finally got their moment in the imaginary sun this afternoon. And in our fifth story, basking in the pretend warmth, they revealed their two-pronged attack. One, resuscitate an old trick, cherry-pick intel about a threat to America, and two, warn that the reform was written by the greatest threat to our or any other nation. Smart people! But so it begins. 7 hours of debate over 2 days with the purely symbolic repeal vote due tomorrow. And in the category of unintentionally funny for the ages and telling, the prize goes to a Republican speaking off the House floor at the GOP's repeal news conference. Congressman Louis Gohmert damning those smart people who wrote the Affordable Care Act.
You need to understand how insidious this bill is. This was written by smart people hoping that there would only be a few things removed.
And thus, Congressman Gohmert may have just stated the number one reason why the Affordable Care Act will never be repealed, ever. Inside the Capitol, Congressman Chris Van Hollen offered the obvious, but possibly still the best critique of the GOP's repeal and replace nonsense. Insurance premiums skyrocketed under the GOP's prior control of both houses of Congress, while that party did nothing. And as for the current GOP replacement,
why not put your plan on the table first so everybody can see it before you begin taking away the important patient protections in this bill, taking effect just since last March?
But Republicans today offered their favorite attacks on the Affordable Care Act, even as those claims were picked apart by independent analysis. The GOP claimed that the Affordable Care Act will create the loss of 650,000 jobs, citing the Congressional Budget Office for this analysis. Not true, unfortunately, according to the Associated Press. The CBO offered no such number, but it did offer an analysis at odds with what the GOP claims it said. Another part of the GOP report, citing the Congressional Research Service, chops a sentence short. According to a simple review by McClatchy newspapers, the omitted sentence, quote, would not be a burden on small business owners. And broadly speaking, many factors limit the impact the law can have on businesses because the law's implementation is staggered and small employers get tax credits, as noted today by Congressman Anthony Weiner.
Small businesses get a 30 to 50% tax incentive to provide health care for their workers. Small businesses do. And you know what requirements they have that go along with that? None. No gaudy regulation, no government takeover.
Meantime, the executive branch, Democrats in Congress, and outside groups are prepared to fight this battle on several fronts. The Department of Health and Human Services today releasing this. If the Affordable Care Act were repealed, between 50 million and 129 million Americans under the age of 65 would be affected because of pre-existing conditions. The percentage of the U.S. population thus gaining protections under this Affordable Care Act is up to 3 times the total number of the elderly in America. A new cable TV ad from the advocacy group Americans United for Change.
The Affordable Care Act gave your family the same health protections members of Congress get, but Republicans want to take that protection away from your family.
And while House Republicans hold anti-health care reform hearings, Senate Democrats will counter with their own hearings. Help Committee Chairman Tom Harkin starts his series of hearings January 27th. Thanks for the birthday present. Then there is the former Senate Majority Leader, Republican Bill Frist. If Mr. Gohmert did not provide a big enough laugh, he said that the Affordable Care Act should not be repealed, even though it needs work. Here's the laugh, quoting, "It is the law of the land and it is the platform, the fundamental platform upon which all future efforts to make that system better for that patient, for that family, will be based." That's not funny, that's wise. Here's the funny. The bill has many strong elements, and those elements, whatever happens, need to be preserved, need to be cuddled, need to be snuggled, need to be promoted, and need to be implemented. Let's bring in Washington Post staff writer, Newsweek columnist, and MSNBC contributor Ezra Klein. Ezra, good evening.
Good evening, Keith.
The cuddling and snuggling report later. But
it's the new civility.
I guess this is sickening, actually, the new civility. This job-killing catchphrase, you've explained previously the difference between employers who cut jobs versus employees who voluntarily leave their jobs or the workforce because of the benefits of the health care laws. But this bears repeating today particularly, so please go ahead and repeat.
Sure. Here's what CBO said. The bill, because it gives people essentially more money in their pocket because it helps them purchase health care insurance, and because it makes it impossible essentially to discriminate based on pre-existing conditions, will give certain people who would like to retire, say a 62-year-old who has diabetes, the ability to retire, because when they leave their employer, they'll be able to buy health care insurance on the market on their own. Now, that does mean you reduce the labor supply somewhat. You have somewhat fewer people who are working because they don't need to work anymore, or they don't want to work anymore. But this is reducing labor supply by making people effectively richer and by making it easier for them to get health care insurance. I do not, because we're all in the new civility, I don't think the Republicans don't want that to happen. They're just twisting what CBO said in order to make it look worse. But that's what they said, that this bill will make people richer and make it easier for them to get health care. All
right, the stuff that Dr. Frist said before he got sort of off on that kinder, really gentler GOP, he would have voted for this act, even though it's not the bill he would have drafted. Now he's criticizing the repeal effort by the Republicans. He also owns stock in a for-profit hospital chain. But is there some suggestion in here that not being involved in a political machine like the Republican Party in the Senate and the House, he has sort of hit that same common sense duh moment that most Americans get to here, that you let the thing evolve, that it is in fact a good start, you make fixes as needed, you don't go back to square one when the first couple of squares have been successfully hurdled?
And this goes to the basic point about the Repeal Act that makes it so sort of problematic. You know, Republicans really do have the votes to change the bill. They had the votes when it was being crafted to get enormous compromises from the Democrats. Senate Democrats, Max Baucus, would have pretty much done anything for 4 Republican votes. I mean, they could have had essentially whatever they wanted. But they never said, here's what we want. In return for this, we will give you our votes on the bill. And here, too, they're trying to go for a whole repeal, which they know they can't get, as opposed to sitting down with the Democrats who've already put forward a willingness to go back to things like the 1099 reporting requirement for small businesses, which Republicans don't like, and change them. And so there's been a real effort to play this based on politics, as opposed to make it a policy that Republicans and conservatives can be happier with. This, despite the fact that it looks a lot like what Mitt Romney did in Massachusetts and what Republicans coalesced around in 1993 under Bob Dole. It's a policy that at another time would have been very congenial to the Republican Party, but because it's got Barack Obama's name next to it, has been greeted with rather less enthusiasm.
And within the policy issue, there are still 2 different approaches. There was much talk from Republicans today about health care reform exploding the deficit, even though the CBO disputes that as well. But while the Republicans are talking like money and this is going to do this and it's going to, they're focusing on all those aspects while the Democrats are working on the human factor, pre-existing conditions, kids, on parents' policies, stuff like that. Is that the basic dynamic of the rest of this thing, however long it lasts?
It often goes both ways. You'll hear Republicans make the deficit argument, which it does not hold up to any sort of serious scrutiny. And you also hear them say, but it cuts Medicare for your grandmother. Of course, cutting Medicare is part of why the bill saves money, and that little tension gets elided a little bit. But, you know, you do see different types of rhetoric in this. Some of it is trying to focus on personal stories. Democrats are trying to move more in that direction. Other bits focus on cost, because in general what people are truly worried about is cost. But the reality is the bill helps individual people, and it does cut cost. It's a good bill, and it should be built on.
Ezra Klein of The Washington Post, great thanks.
Thank you.
For more on the politics of the whole deal, let's turn to MSNBC political analyst Richard Wolff, who also covers the White House with the Daily Beast and is, of course, author of Revival, The Struggle for Survival Inside the Obama White House. Richard, good evening.
Good evening, Keith.
Did we bury the lead here, in fact, because of all the good humor that Louis Gohmert offered us and this back and forth Don Quixote stuff? The Democrats rebutted misuse of data by the GOP, and then they had their own set of easy-to-digest data for their case. Democrats prepared for something?
They are. They're prepared and more disciplined being in the minority than they were in the majority. I think they're feeling some wind behind their backs here because, remember, the president's numbers have gone over that psychological mark of 50%. And, by the way, the poll numbers on repeal have also shifted since just November. That most recent AP poll said only 26% support repeal compared to 43% that want the law to do more, not less. So the politics has changed in important ways, but you are looking at a Democratic Party that has something that they know how to defend. Remember, a year ago, they didn't know what they were talking about because it hadn't been decided. All of those messy negotiations, the sausage making, made it extremely hard to rebut anything because they had nothing to put their hands around. Now it's here. Those provisions are popular when you're talking about pre-existing conditions or what seniors get. So it's a different world.
If just support within the Republican pollees has dropped from just about 61% to repeal just after the election to 49% now, is there any contemplation that that kind of number might continue to change at anywhere near that sort of pace, and that at some point this continuing stagecraft that they're doing in the House might actually pit the Republicans against their base rather than pandering to their base?
Well, I think that's going to bottom out at some point because there is that hardcore that just hates everything that Obama does and finds that healthcare has been a sort of radicalizing force for them because of all their heated rhetoric around it. But repeal is not what Republicans, even Republicans, really think is the most important priority. What they want to see is action on the economy and on jobs. So apart from your hardcore of Tea Party folks and the most loyal listeners to the Hannity show, you've actually got people who want Congress, even the Republican majority in the House, to be talking about something else. They are off topic, seriously off topic, for the very people who put them in power.
The president put out something of a boilerplate statement today that touted the best elements of the health care law. It certainly wasn't critical of it, but he also said he's willing to work with Republicans to improve it, which is kind of, I suppose, an unintentional dog whistle to the left of, you're going to abandon all the good stuff? For what reason? Why say this if obviously the Republicans don't want a compromise and would take credit for anything that they manage to change in the bill and claim that there is no President Obama and
Right. Well, he is not about to give up the important provisions in this law. He is obviously aware that there's going to have to be lots of tinkering around as this bill goes into force, as this law goes into force, excuse me. They're going to have to be amendments and changes to it over the course of the next several years. But being reasonable, looking reasonable, and saying to Republicans, look, put something on the table here, that has not done him any harm. That's one reason why his numbers have picked up. Only one, though, but it's an important tone for him to strike at this time. So until we see what specifics, apart from the 1099 provision that Ezra talked about, until we see what specifics the president is talking about, I don't think people have a reason to be that worried that he's going to gut something that he thinks is the most important piece of his legacy so far. MSNBC political analyst Richard Wolff, great thanks as always, and you owe me $1 for not bringing up the snuggling or whatever quotes from Frist. We can cuddle later. Thanks, Keith. Okay, thanks for that, Richard.
So the Republicans are trying something that couldn't get through the Senate and will get vetoed by the president if it somehow did. What is the president doing? Writing up Republican talking points about regulations threatening jobs in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. Ariana Huffington joins me next on the